Hello, everybody. Once again, this is Ryan Paulson here, the Rooster of Tucson, here to wake you up to the issues that matter and remind you that paying attention is still one of the most powerful things a citizen can do. Once again, reporting live here from Hack Studios in Tucson, Arizona, aka Cartel Hell. I know it's burning up still, baby, getting crispy out here. Once again, this is the Citizen Soldier Podcast. And I want to take a second right now to say thank you to everybody out there for spending a little bit of your day with me. Whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, or tuning in on Rumble or BitChute or one of the other media platforms that carry our RSS feed, I want to say thank you for supporting independent media and for being part of this growing community. You know, week after week, this audience continues to grow, and that's because of you. Every share, every comment, every conversation that you have about this show, it helps us reach somebody new. And, you know, we hear a lot of these so-called conversations about misinformation out there and disinformation, fake news, independent media, corporate media, and everybody seems to be pointing fingers at everybody else, and somewhere in the middle of all that, there are ordinary people just trying to figure out what's actually going on. They're trying to raise a family, they're paying bills just to get through another work week and, make sense of a world that seems to get louder every single day with distortion. And that's what's got me thinking about today's conversation. And it's not because I have all the answers, because I don't. I'm only human. And not because I'm asking you to simply take my word for anything, because I don't want you to do that. And I'm asking you to stay curious, ask questions, and look a little deeper than the headlines. Be willing to challenge your own opinions just as much as you're willing to challenge somebody else's. That's how stronger communities are built. And that's how responsible citizens grow. And tonight we're talking about citizen journalism versus all the mainstream media. It's not a boxing match out here. It shouldn't be one side cheering while the other side is getting knocked down. The real question is whether we're becoming better informed as a society, or whether we're simply consuming more information than ever before without taking the time to understand it. And I think that's a conversation worth having, people. What do you think? Well, when I was growing up, it was way different. The evening news came on, and at one point, if you wanted to know what was happening in your city or around the world, you waited for the newspaper to hit the driveway. You sat down and you watched the local news. There were fewer voices and fewer outlets, and definitely fewer opportunities for ordinary people to tell their stories. And today, that world doesn't exist anymore, thank God. Every single one of us carries a broadcasting studio in our pocket. Every smartphone has the ability to capture photos, record high-definition videos, and stream live to thousands of people and upload information within seconds. That right there is an incredible amount of power when you actually stop and think about it. Think about some of the biggest stories you've seen over the past decade. In many cases, the very first images didn't come from television crews. They came from ordinary people who happened to be standing in the right place at the right time. They pulled out their phones, hit record, and documented history as it unfolded. And that right there, that right there is the power of citizen journalism, my friends. It gives everyday people an opportunity to document what's happening in their neighborhoods. at city council meetings, during community events, after severe weather, or in the middle of emergencies. Sometimes those recordings answer important questions. And sometimes they preserve evidence that otherwise would have been lost. And sometimes they simply give people a firsthand look at events that affect their own communities. And I think that's something that's worth appreciating, my friends. As I said before, for a long time, people depended almost entirely on large news organizations to decide which stories reached the public. And today, if a neighborhood is dealing with a dangerous intersection, if a local business owner has a story to tell, or if residents are organizing to improve their own communities, they don't necessarily have to wait for someone else to decide if it's newsworthy. They can tell that story themselves. And to me, that right there is one of the most positive changes that technology has brought us. But with every opportunity, well, it comes responsibility. Just because we can publish something doesn't always mean that we should publish it immediately. And just because a video goes viral doesn't automatically make it complete. Just like a headline spreads across social media, it doesn't guarantee it's accurate, and that's where I think we all have room to grow. And one of the biggest lessons that I have learned over the years, people, is that context matters. You can sit there and watch 30 seconds of a video and think you understand the entire situation, only to find out later that there were 5 minutes before that clip and 10 minutes after it, and that completely changed the story, of course, and life usually isn't as simple as a 15-second clip on social media. And that's why I encourage people to slow down, ask questions, look for additional information, and listen to different perspectives. And not because you have to agree with them, no, but because understanding doesn't require agreement. And that's something we've lost in touch here in society. Somewhere along the way, we've convinced ourselves that listening to another point of view somehow, it weakens our own. And I don't believe that. In fact, I think listening makes your own argument stronger because it forces you to think more carefully about what you believe and why you believe it. And that right there is true, my friend. Trust me. Whether we're talking about local government, public safety, education, or taxes, or community issues, or national headlines, critical thinking isn't about winning arguments. It's about getting closer to the truth. And sometimes the truth is more complicated than we'd like it to be. Sometimes there isn't a simple answer at all. And sometimes the facts force us to rethink our first impression. And personally, I'd rather change my opinion because I learned something new than spend my life defending an opinion that wasn't supported by the facts. And I think that's a healthier way to approach almost every conversation we have. But unfortunately, today's media environment doesn't always reward patience. It rewards speed, it rewards emotions, outrage. The faster people react, the more attention a story receives. And the more emotional people get, the longer they stay engaged. And that's not unique to one platform or one news organization. That's simply the reality of how modern media operates. And that's exactly why personal responsibility matters more today than ever. Because nobody else is going to think for you. Nobody else can decide what questions you're going to ask. And nobody else can determine whether you're willing to do the homework before forming an opinion. And that right there is your responsibility. And in my own personal opinion, that's part of what it means to be a citizen. And one thing I've noticed over the years is that somewhere along the way, people, we've become conditioned to react before we reflect. A headline pops up on our phone, and within seconds, people are already choosing sides. Like, they haven't read the article yet, and they haven't looked for additional sources, and they haven't stopped to ask whether the information is complete. They've simply just reacted. And I don't say that to criticize anybody, because honestly, we've all done it. We're busy, we have jobs to get to, families to take care of, responsibilities pulling us in every direction. And the internet was designed to keep our attention, and it's very good at doing exactly that. But every once in a while, it's worth slowing down and asking ourselves a simple question. Am I reacting because I understand what's happening? Or am I reacting because someone else told me how I should feel? And those are two very different things. The older I get, the more I realize that asking good questions is often more valuable than pretending to have quick answers. Because let me tell you something, good journalists, we understand that. And good investigators understand that as well. They gather information, compare evidence, and let the facts guide them, instead of forcing the facts to fit to a conclusion that they've already decided on. That's a habit every one of us can develop. And you don't have to be a reporter to think like a reporter. And you don't need to be a part of the press to ask thoughtful questions. And you definitely don't need a television studio to care about what's happening in your own neighborhood. You simply have to be willing to pay attention. That's something I think we've lost in many communities. Look at what's happening right now to Tucson. We've been invaded because of a previous regime. And like I said, they opened up the door for thousands of terrorists who live amongst us. And what's happening at the end of our own street? What's really happening? They can name national politicians, but couldn't tell you when the next city council meeting takes place. They know every trending topic on social media, but they don't know the names of the people making decisions that directly affect their neighborhoods. And I think we can do better. Definitely, Tucson. Like, we have to stand up and voice our opinions. And, real change usually starts at the local level. And not with these shell companies, not with these fake media PR companies that are here to polish the turds. Okay? We see this all the time on social media. It starts with people attending public meetings. It starts with people asking respectful questions and expecting honest answers. It starts with citizens taking an interest in the place they call home. And that, to me, is where citizen journalism has tremendous value. And sometimes the biggest stories never, ever make national headlines. Never. Maybe it's a neighborhood organization cleaning up after a storm. Maybe it's local businesses helping out families. Those stories matter too. In fact, I'd argue that they matter more than many of the topics I see out there dominating the news feeds. Because those are the stories that remind us communities are still filled with good people doing good things every single day. But unfortunately, those stories don't always attract millions of clicks and views. Good news usually travels slower than bad news. And acts of kindness don't spread as quickly as outrage. And problem solving definitely doesn't trend the way controversy does. So, and one of the things I'd like, this podcast to become known for, and is highlighting people who are making a positive difference. Yes, we're going to ask very difficult questions. And yes, we're going to discuss serious issues affecting Tucson, Arizona, and the community as a whole. Because accountability, it matters, my friend. Transparency matters, and public safety matters. But so does hope. Because if every conversation only focuses on, what's broken, eventually people start believing nothing can be fixed. I'm one of those people. I find myself, looking at what's going on and like nothing's changing. But, honestly, I don't believe that's true. I've met too many hardworking people here, too many honest first responders, and too many dedicated teachers and a lot of awesome veterans and volunteers here, and too many parents working overtime to give their kids a better future. They're out there every single day quietly making their community stronger. And those people definitely deserve more recognition. And that's one of the reasons I started to build the Citizen Soldier podcast. Not simply to point out problems or listen to me bitch and complain about my own personal opinions, but to encourage people to become part of the solution. You don't have to run for office to make a difference. You don't need millions of followers on social media. And, sometimes making a difference is as simple as checking on an elderly neighbor, during the summer heat. Sometimes it's mentoring a young person who needs someone to believe in them. Those things don't usually make headlines, but they make communities stronger for sure. And, the communities, they're built one person at a time. And that's why I often come back to personal responsibility. It's easy to blame somebody else. It's always easy to point the finger. It's much harder to ask yourself, what can I do today to improve the place where I live? That question changes everything. Because once you start asking it, you stop waiting for somebody else to solve everything for you. You begin looking for ways to contribute. You become more involved, informed, prepared, and, before long, the people around you begin doing the same thing. Leadership has a funny way of working like that. It's contagious. Not because people are forced to follow, but because they see someone taking responsibility and they're inspired to do the same. And I think our country could use a little more of that. Less shouting, less politics, more listening, less amusing bullshit, and definitely more intelligent conversations. Not because we'll always agree on everything, we won't, but because respectful disagreement has always been one of the biggest strengths of a free society. When people stop talking to each other, that's when real problems begin. And, one question that I always ask myself from time to time is, what kind of community do we want to leave behind? Not just for ourselves, but for our children and for the next generation that's going to inherit everything that we're building today. It's easy to complain about the direction things are going. Anybody can point out problems. They can spend hours online arguing with strangers, but eventually there comes a point where we have to decide whether we're going to be spectators or participants. And I will always participate. That's one of the reasons that this podcast exists. I wanted to create a place where people could have conversations about real issues without every discussion turning into a shouting match. And I wanted a place where people could think out loud, challenge ideas respectfully, and maybe even leave with a different perspective than when they arrived. And that right there, it doesn't mean we will always agree. But honestly, I don't expect us to. Some of you listening right now will probably disagree with everything I've already said. And that is perfectly fine. In fact, like I said, I welcome it. And, healthy disagreement isn't something we should fear. It's something that we should learn from. If everybody in the room thinks exactly the same way, chances are nobody's going to ask enough questions. And the goal isn't to create an audience that agrees with me. The goal is to encourage an audience that thinks for themselves. And that right there is a big difference. When you begin thinking independently, something interesting happens. You become harder to manipulate, You stop reacting emotionally to every little headline, and you become more patient. You become more observant. You become more interested in facts than in winning arguments. And those are qualities that make better citizens, and they're also qualities that make better parents, neighbors, leaders, communities. And I think sometimes we underestimate how much influence one person can have. I say this all the time, one conversation it can change somebody's perspective. And, one encouraging word can keep someone moving forward during a difficult week. And that one little act of kindness, it can restore a little bit of faith in humanity. You never, ever underestimate the ripple effect of doing the right thing, especially when nobody's watching, and that's something I try to remind myself every single day. Because let's be honest, life isn't always easy. Everybody listening to this podcast is carrying something with them right now. And some of you are working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Probably some of you are, caring for your elderly parents. We all have battles. But the important thing is refusing to let those battles define us. And I've always believed that adversity reveals character. It shows us who we are when things aren't going according to plan. Because it is easy to stay positive when everything's going your way. The real test comes when life knocks you down a couple pegs. Do you stay there or do you get back up? And that's a question only you can answer. I've said it before and I'll continue saying it. Discipline will take you farther than motivation ever will. Because motivation comes and goes. Some mornings you wake up feeling unstoppable. Other mornings you don't feel like doing anything. And that's normal. The people who continue moving forward aren't necessarily the most talented. They're the ones who continue showing up even when they don't feel like it. And that's true. And, especially in the gym, it's true. It's true at work and it's true in your relationships. Nobody's going to hand you understanding. You have to pursue it, read it, listen to it, and ask questions. And you always have to stay curious. Every once in a while, people, you have to be willing to admit that you are wrong. There's strengths in that, not weaknesses. And the strongest people I've ever met weren't afraid to learn something new. They weren't afraid to adjust their thinking caps, and that right there is growth, maturity, and wisdom, friends. As we wrap up today's conversation, I want to leave you with one final thought. The future of our communities isn't determined by the loudest voices. It's determined by the people who consistently show up. The parents attending school meetings, the volunteers serving their neighborhoods, the first responders answering calls at all hours of the night. The veterans who continue serving long after taking off the uniform. The small business owners opening their doors every morning. The citizens who refuse to give up on the places that they call home. And those people don't always make the headlines, but they're the backbone of every single strong community out there. So wherever you're listening today, I hope this episode encourages you to stay engaged, stay curious, and keep asking those questions. Support honest conversations and listen before you judge, and definitely think before you act out there. And never underestimate your ability to make a positive difference where you live. Once again, I want to say thank you all for spending part of your day with me. If you enjoyed today's discussion, help us continue growing this community. Subscribe wherever you're listening. Leave a review. Share this episode with somebody who values thoughtful conversations and believes informed citizens can make a difference. Once again, my friends, this is Ryan Paulson. The Rooster of Tucson, reporting live here from Hack Studios in Tucson, Arizona, a.k.a. Cartel Hell. Once again, until next time, take care of yourself, take care of your family, your neighbors, and stay alert, stay informed, and remember this. The strongest communities are built by ordinary people who refuse to stop caring. This is a Citizen Soldier podcast. Over and out.